Meeden Baohong versus Arches. Let's find out which one's better when it comes to texture, masking materials compatibility, buckling, color vibrancy, wet on wet and wet on damp techniques, and lifting method. From where I am, a Meeden Baohong roll costs 8,600 pesos or $170, while Arches roll is priced at 11,000 pesos or $220. Here's Meeden Baohong artist grade cold pressed 300 GSM and my Arches cold pressed 300 GSM. Let's check the texture. Meeden Baohong has a good texture for its cold pressed version. It looks almost the same with Arches, but this one seems to have a more uniform texture. The difference will be evident on the final painting later. From experience, I know that both paper do well with masking materials such as masking tape and fluid, since they are both made with 100% cotton. I did not stretch my paper, so I'll expect buckling when I paint the papers later. Video here on how I stretch my papers. I'm leaving out the flowers to keep them white. Here, they're both starting to buckle, but I don't really mind that for these demo paintings. I loaded my brush with royal blue and painted on my paper while they are still wet, and you can see how well they react with pigments. I'll also introduce manganese blue in the background, and I want you to observe how the pigment spreads on the paper and how vibrant they look. For comparison purposes, I'll paint a swatch using the same colors on a student grade paper, Canson, which isn't 100% cotton, and look at the color vibrancy and texture. This is cold pressed too, but there's less texture compared to our artist grade papers. I'll take my goat's hair brush and lightly rub it on the paper for the background to mix and remove some of the feathering of the pigments. Both papers are still damp, so I'll darken the corners to create a fish eye effect. Here, you'll see that there's more feathering on Meeden Baohong. I got carried away and forgot to record some parts, but here's how I did it. I switched to a smaller brush and painted some ripples while the paper is still damp. This is what some call the wet on damp technique, where the paper is starting to dry, but it is still wet. By this time, the difference on the texture really shows. Notice how there's more feathering on Meeden Baohong compared to Arches. I'm also lifting some pigments while this is still damp, and the technique works well on both papers. I left the first layer to dry, and now the difference on the texture is pretty evident. I was actually surprised by this. I've been using Meeden Baohong for a year now and consumed 2 rolls, but only used 2 pads of Arches, and this is the first time I'm comparing the two. Now let's lift some paint using a flat synthetic brush and a paper towel. This is perfect if you want to correct mistakes or soften some hard edges. Wet the brush and lightly scrub on areas you want to lift and pat it dry with a paper towel. Doing it first on my Meeden Baohong paper, and you can see how effective it is. Take note of the pigment's staining rating though. Now onto my Arches, and it's performing the same. I switched to a softer brush, a generic Chinese calligraphy brush, and lifting some ripple shapes. It has a softer effect compared to the first one. Let's add another layer of paint and do a direct painting or wet on dry technique. I'll paint the shadow shapes and soften them later with the same brush. With both papers, I have tried adding 5 to 10 layers of paint and they did incredibly well. I tried the same with student grade papers, but I didn't get this kind of result, and some are starting to get damaged with multiple layers of painting or glazing or layering. Adding final details and both paintings are done. If you find value in this video, please boop that like button so we can reach more people who also have the same question as we do. Which is better, Meeden Baohong or Arches Watercolor Paper? Personally, I am planning to use Arches now because I really love working with wet on wet backgrounds and wet on damp for the finer details. I love how there's less feathering on Arches, but Meeden Baohong performs well too, at a lower price. Which paper have you tried? Or are you planning to purchase? Let me know in the comments below.